Alright, welcome back to the Recipe Analyst. Today I'll be making a Greek Style Omeleta from the Zaytinya Cookbook. I'm gonna get some water over high heat so it can come to a boil so we can blanch the kale a little bit later on. So I'm gonna separate 6 eggs so I can go ahead and put the rest of the eggs in the refrigerator before I start working on the kale. So we don't want the stems or the ribs in this recipe. So I'm gonna go ahead and tear off the leafy part from the kale and discard the ribs. I'm sure the ribs can be used for something else, but I'm just gonna go ahead and get rid of them. You could use a knife for this, but I think using your hands is a little bit easier. So once I have all the leafy part separated from the ribs, I go ahead and put that in a colander so I can set it aside. And then I'm gonna work on the leek. So in this recipe, it says just to use the light green part and the white part. So I cut off the darker green part and then I cut it in half long ways so I can clean out the insides. Leeks can be pretty dirty on the inside, so you want to make sure that you rinse them thoroughly on the inside. Now I go ahead and slice them fairly thinly. Then I'm gonna go ahead and do the same thing for the sweet onion. The recipe calls for a small sweet onion and this is a pretty large one, so I just use half of it. And right there I was cutting it so I can have smaller pieces once I slice it. Then I'm gonna go ahead and chop some chives and get some dill fronds separated. These are just for the garnish at the end, but it's nice to have them ready to go for later on. And of course you should rinse your vegetables before, cooking them or even chopping them, just to keep them cleaner than otherwise. So I rinsed the dill as well as the chives a little bit earlier. I'm gonna set those aside so I can have them ready for the end. And the ice water is for the kale, so when the kale is done blanching, I can put it into the ice water to stop it from cooking. So I blanch the kale for about 2 minutes, then I use the colander to drain it. And I transfer the kale to the ice bath. And I use my hand to mix it around to get it to cool off a little bit quicker. I go ahead and pour off all the ice. And then I just use my hand to squeeze out the majority of the water that's left behind. And once I have most of that water squeezed out with my hand, I just press it against the sides of the colander to squeeze out any excess water. Now I'm going to spread out the kale in a fairly even flat layer on the cutting board so I could go ahead and chop it up. Now the recipe calls for a non-stick pan. I don't have a non-stick pan, so I use a cast iron, which is the closest thing I have to a non-stick. So I melt the butter into that pan and put the leeks and onions in there. And while that's cooking, I'm going to go ahead and crack the eggs into this bowl. Then I'm going to beat it until it's pretty smooth and homogeneous. So after about 10 minutes, the leeks and onions were nice and soft, so I go ahead and add the kale and mix that in. And the recipe says to cook it for about another 10 minutes, but for me, I let it go for about 8 minutes. Back to the eggs, I add 2 tablespoons of feta, and at the end we're going to add 1 tablespoon as garnish. And once the vegetables are nice and soft, I go ahead and transfer them to a plate and try to spread them out pretty flat and even so that they can cool quicker. And it took about 10 minutes for them to cool. They weren't completely cold, but it was cool enough so I could add it to the eggs. I go ahead and add 2 tablespoons of olive oil to that cast iron skillet. Season the eggs with a tablespoon of salt, and I go ahead and add the cooled vegetables. And I go ahead and fold them in just so it's relatively evenly distributed throughout the eggs. Go ahead and heat up the oil, and once the oil is heated, I add the egg mixture to the pan. So for this step, the pan is supposed to be an 8 to 9 inch pan. I didn't have an 8 to 9 inch nonstick, so I'm using a 10.5 inch cast iron. So I have to do a little bit of work to make sure it's pretty even in the pan. And also disturb the bottom to prevent sticking as much as possible. And shaking the pan a little bit is supposed to prevent some sticking as well. Alright, so now this is the hardest part. You find out if you have any sticking or not. So I put a plate on top of the pan and flipped it over, and I definitely have some sticking. So instead of giving up, I just transfer as much as I can from the pan that's stuck onto the plate, and then I go ahead and clean out as much as the rest of the stuck on stuff as possible and get rid of that. I go ahead and add the remaining tablespoon of olive oil and heat that up. And once the oil is heated up, I go ahead and slide the omelet back into the pan with the raw side down. Of course, since it didn't hold together properly, since I'm not using a nonstick, I have to do a little bit of work to get it even again. So I kind of use this chopping motion to break up the larger pieces that kind of form lumps. And after about 3 to 4 minutes, I called it done, and I added the garnishes, so the dill, the chives, the cheese, and some flaky sea salt. So what did I think of this omelet? Honestly, it's nothing special. It kind of tastes like what you expected it to taste like. You can taste most of the ingredients that go into it. So the vegetables, you can taste them all. And every now and then you get to taste a little bit of the feta cheese. Honestly, I think you can make an omelet that tastes just as good, if not better, in a fraction of the time. If you just chop up some onions, maybe some chives, add some cheese, and make a more standard omelet rather than this one where you have to go through blanching the kale, cooking it again, and going through that tricky flipping step. So honestly, I'm not sure that it's worth all of that time and effort. So I ended up giving this recipe a 6 out of 10 just because it took about an hour and a half for me to make it, and the result isn't better than an omelet that I can make in probably 10 to 15 minutes. Of course, using a nonstick skillet might have saved you a few minutes, but that really wasn't the part that took the most time. Anyway, thanks again for watching. Let me know of any recipes that you want me to try, and as always, you can read more about this recipe on theRecipeAnalyst.com. Thanks again.